Hello everyone and welcome back to the second part of our reproductive lecture. So here in this lecture we are going to go over the leftover topics, which is a little more detail regarding the male and female reproductive structures, as well as the hormones that are being produced and the effects that each of these hormones will have. And then eventually we will discuss how production of these hormones during the fetal life will affect the nervous development. And then as always, we will conclude this lecture by having some practice questions. Alright, so first I would like to go over the male reproductive structures as well as the male hormones. Once we complete that one in details, then we move on to female reproductive structures and discuss the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, parturition, and lactation. Alright, so starting with males. So as we just discussed, there are gonads, ducts and tubes, accessory glands, as well as external genitalia that is present in both male and female structures. So here we are going in details regarding the male structures. So gonads or testes in males is responsible for production of sperm and testosterone. Now, considering that the testes require temperature of 35 degrees centigrade in order to be able to produce sperm, therefore it has to be outside the body, because inside the body temperature is closer to 37 degrees C. So that's why testes are actually being suspended in a pouch of skin that is called scrotum. And so by being suspended outside the body, testes have a slightly lower temperature of 35 degrees C compared to the rest of our body. Now, when the body gets too hot, that's the time that actually the cremaster muscle, so cremaster muscle is the muscle that determines this distance of the testes inside the scrotum. So when testes become too hot, the cremaster muscle will relax to allow the testes to move farther away from the body. On the other hand, when the temperature is cold, the cremaster muscle will contract, and that's the time that the testes will be pulled closer to the body in order to maintain a 35 degrees C temperature. Now, each testis is divided into a series of lobules, each of which contains a tightly packed seminiferous tubules, which are the site of sperm production. And then there are two types of cells that help with this process. One is the Sertoli cells, which help to nurse or mother these cells. And these Sertoli cells are part of the seminiferous tubules. And these Sertoli cells are actually being activated by the follicular stimulating hormone. And so basically, in other words, Sertoli cells help nurture the sperm cell during the spermatogenesis process. So these, you can call them nurse cells or mother cells. Then we also have Leydig cells that are being activated by the luteinizing hormone, and these Leydig cells will produce testosterone. Next, we have the ducts and tubules. The first structure that I would like to discuss is called rete testes, which is basically a network of ducts that help collect sperm from seminiferous tubules to epididymis. So you know how we mentioned that seminiferous tubules is the site of the sperm production, and then epididymis is the site of sperm storage. So their transfer from seminiferous tubule to epididymis is happening with the rete testes. And then epididymis itself, it's basically a comma-shaped organ that lies at the posterior border of the testes. So it's located posterior to testes. And it helps to store as well as helps with the maturation of the sperm. Now, sperm can remain in epididymis for as long as multiple weeks. And during this time, they're ready to either get expelled or they could also get reabsorbed by the body. Next, we are having ductus, or the other name for which is vas deferens, which is a long duct that connects epididymis to the urethra. All right, so vas deferens is connecting epididymis to urethra. And then next we are having ejaculatory duct, so ejaculatory duct, which is formed from the union of the seminal vesicle ducts with vas deferens. And then from here on, we are having urethra that will extend from the urinary bladder to the tip of the penis, and that would be the terminal duct for both the reproductive as well as the urinary system. So this is the image that I've shown you in the previous lecture. So we just discussed inside the seminiferous tubules of the testes, sperm will be produced, and via the rete testes, sperm will be stored, will be moved to the epididymis, inside which they would get stored and undergo maturation. Then we have vas deferens that will transfer all the way, it's a long duct that connects epididymis all the way to the urethra. Now combination of vas deferens with the seminal vesicles will lead to the formation of the ejaculatory duct. And then next we are having urethra, which is served both for ejaculation of the sperm, and it also can be used for urination. And as we just discussed in the previous video, if you're having difficulty remembering the order of events, it's called 7 up is the memory aid. So starting with seminiferous tubules, then we are having epididymis, after that we have vas deferens, then we have the ejaculatory duct, which is from combination of seminal vesicles and vas deferens. After that we have nothing, so ignore N. Then we have urethra, and then finally we have penis. All right. Next, I would like to discuss the accessory glands. So in the previous lecture, we briefly touched upon different accessory glands, but we didn't really go into details. So here I'd like to discuss in a little more detail what's the function of every one of the accessory glands that are present in the male reproductive organs. So the first one I'd like to discuss is called seminal vesicles, which are actually the secretory glands that are attached to vas deferens to form the ejaculatory duct. So here we have the seminal vesicles that are attached to the vas deferens right here, and these are forming the ejaculatory duct. And secretions from seminal vesicles accounts actually for about 60 to 70% of the semen volume. And these secretions include, for instance, fructose, which provides the source of ATP for sperm. It contains prostaglandins, which induces contraction of smooth muscles along the reproductive tract in order to help with the propulsion of the sperm. There is also fibrinogen in order to form a temporary clot to protect the sperm from the acidic environment of vagina. And then there are also alkaline solutions from secretions of the seminal vesicles that will activate the sperm. So actually spermatozoa becomes mobile after it's being mixed with the alkaline secretions of the seminal vesicles. All right, so that was the very first accessory glands, and these were the main secretions from this gland. Now, if you need to pause the video, you can go ahead and do that. Otherwise, I would like to erase and go over the next accessory gland, which is the prostate gland. And so basically, prostate gland is a round muscular structure that encircles the proximal part of the urethra. So here you can see that the prostate gland is here encircling the urethra. And so that's the reason that patients who are having prostate gland hyperplasia or benign prostatic hyperplasia, the other name for it, it's the time when the prostate enlarges, and these patients complain that they are having difficulty urinating. And so you can see the reason for that is that this prostate gland is actually encircling the beginning of urethra, and so if the prostate gland enlarges, there would be difficulty with urination. All right, so going back to the prostate gland, it accounts for about 20 to 30% of the volume of semen, and the secretions from the prostate include seminal plasmin in order to prevent urinary tract infections, and it also contains an alkaline fluid. Because vagina is acidic, we need an alkaline fluid to neutralize the environment of vagina and help with the survival of sperm. So this will neutralize the acidic environment of vagina. All right, so I'm going to erase this and move on with the next gland that is called bulbourethral gland, or the other name for which is Cowper's gland. And these are actually pea-sized glands that are located underneath the prostate, and their function is to secrete an alkaline substance to provide lubrication during sexual intercourse, and of course it will also neutralize the acidic droplets from urine. So acidic droplets from urine. And this gland accounts for only 1% or maybe even less than 1% of the total volume of semen. So in summary, a typical ejaculation releases about 2 to 5 ml of semen, which is from addition of all the secretions from all these secretory glands or accessory glands that we just discussed. And then on top of that, there would be protease as well as fibrinolysin that is included in the semen. And so the function of the protease is to dissolve the mucus secretion of the vagina, while the function of the fibrinolysin is to liquefy the semen clot. So we just discussed how there is fibrin in order to form a clot and protects from acidic environment of vagina. There is also fibrinolysin in the semen that will help dissolve and liquefy that semen clot so that the sperm can move on. All right, next we are having the external genitalia, which is composed of the scrotum and penis. So we already discussed about the function of the scrotum. It's basically a pouch of skin that encloses testes, and since the skin is now hanging outside the body, it will help maintain a temperature of 35 degrees C. And that's actually the lower temperature that is required for sperm production. And then the penis is composed of the 3 cylindrical columns of erectile tissue. So it contains erectile tissue that actually stiffens during the arousal state, at which time the parasympathetic nervous system induces relaxation of vessels. So during the arousal state, the parasympathetic system induces relaxation of the vessels, as a consequence of which now more blood will enter the penis and cause erection. So now we are having erection from relaxation of the blood vessels. And then there is also a role for the sympathetic nervous system, which provides a forceful movement of the semen out of the urethra, the other term for which is ejaculation. So SNS helps with ejaculation. And once you enter the medical school, you will know that they have actually a memory aid to remember what's the role of SNS and what's the role of PNS. So this is what I've learned in medical school. Point and shoot. So the parasympathetic nervous system helps to point, or in other words, it helps with the erection. That's the job of the parasympathetic nervous system. And then the job of the sympathetic nervous system is to shoot, or in other words, to ejaculate. All right, I hope that memory aid helps. Now let's move on to the hormones that are being secreted by the male reproductive organs. So everything here starts with the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus releases the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which acts on the anterior pituitary gland. So here it's shown in orange. So the gonadotropin releasing hormone acts on the anterior pituitary gland to release two different hormones. One is the follicular stimulating hormone, and the other one is the luteinizing hormone. So here I'd like to discuss in a little more detail regarding the function of every one of these hormones. So first we have the follicular stimulating hormone, and what it does is that it initiates the spermatogenesis, and it also acts on the Sertoli cells to help with nurturing the sperm. So here you can see that the FSH induces the Sertoli cells to help with the germ cells to produce sperm. So it helps with the spermatogenesis, and it acts on the Sertoli cells, which are our nurse cells. We just discussed this earlier in this lecture. Now, Sertoli cells also produce an androgen binding protein, and it helps maintain the local levels of testosterone. So there would be maintenance of the local levels of testosterone by production of the androgen binding protein. Now, I'd like to mention here that Sertoli cells also has other functions, and these include, for instance, formation of tight junctions in order to provide a blood and testes barrier. Because if the immune system gets exposed to our testes, it's possible that it mounts an immune attack because it doesn't recognize really the testes. There are some structures, some organs in our body that our immune system is not really familiar with, and these include, for instance, testes or the eye. That's why they say if there is damage to one of these structures and the immune system recognizes it, it's possible that there would be mounting of an immune attack against the other one. And so here, Sertoli cells are maintaining a blood-testes barrier so that the immune system doesn't really recognize the antigens in the testes. In addition, Sertoli cells also produce the anti-Mullerian hormone, and it also secretes inhibin in order to reduce the FSH secretion. So if there is too much FSH secretion, Sertoli cell would send a signal that, okay, I had enough, that's enough, we don't need that much FSH. So it sends an inhibin signal, which is a negative feedback to the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus in order to decrease the FSH secretion. All right, so those were all the functions of FSH as well as the Sertoli cells. And if you've noticed earlier in this lecture, we discussed how FSH acts on Sertoli cells or nurse cells, while LH acts on Leydig cells, which produce testosterone. So let's go back here, and now let's discuss luteinizing hormone. So I'm going to erase all this. Now let's discuss about the luteinizing hormone. So luteinizing hormone, basically it stimulates the Leydig cells in order to produce androgen or testosterone. And testosterone is the major androgen, and its production actually starts at the puberty in order to help increase body hair, muscle mass, bone growth, and then also induce the growth of the penis, testes, and then induce secretion of the oil producing glands. Other functions of testosterone, let me erase all this, is to increase metabolism, deepen the voice, enhance sex drive, and it also helped with the spermatogenesis process. All right, so those were all the functions of the Leydig cells: increase metabolism, deepen voice, increase sex drive, enhance spermatogenesis, increase body hair, body muscle mass, bone growth, growth of the penis and testes, as well as increased secretion of the oil producing glands. Now, similar to Sertoli cells that sends a negative feedback, testosterone also sends a negative feedback to the pituitary gland to lower FSH secretion. So if there is too much testosterone secretion, it sends negative signals to both the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus to decrease secretion of hormones that initially initiated testosterone secretion. So this is an example of negative feedback loop. The products of our glands will inhibit the original hormones that has initiated their secretion. So it was GnRH and luteinizing hormone that induced Sertoli cell and Leydig cells to start producing hormones. And both of the hormones that are produced, testosterone and inhibin, will now go back to bite back on gonadotropin releasing hormone as well as FSH and luteinizing hormone to decrease their secretion. So this is an example of a negative feedback loop. All right, so now we are done with the description of the male's reproductive organs. Next, we would like to discuss the female reproductive structures and hormone control. All right, so here ovaries are producing eggs, the other name for which is ova, and there is also secretion of female sex hormones. Now, what happens during the prenatal development is that oogonia divide by mitosis to produce primary oocytes, and these primary oocytes will undergo meiosis, but they arrest at prophase 1 until puberty. So it's not like that the meiosis will be all the way completed in an hour or so. No, it takes a long time. Primary oocyte from prenatal stage till puberty will arrest at the prophase. Now at this time, once a female reaches a puberty, certain changes happen, and these include, for instance, increased body growth, development of pubic and axillary hairs, increased secretion of oil secreting glands. There would be breast development, and also by puberty there will be beginning of menstruation. Now, what happens at puberty is that the FSH, or the other word for it is the follicular stimulating hormone, will act on the primary oocytes in order to reinitiate the meiosis phase. So from here on, since FSH has acted on the primary oocyte, meiosis will start to continue, and it will continue to go until metaphase 2. And at this stage, again, meiosis will arrest at this point. Now, if there is no fertilization to happen, the egg will degenerate. If fertilization happens, then that's the time that meiosis will continue and complete. So just notice that meiosis doesn't go all the way from beginning to the end. It goes through different steps and halts before it resumes production of the egg in females. So from prenatal stage till puberty, meiosis was halted at prophase 1. After puberty, it resumed up to metaphase 2, but it halts again at metaphase 2. Only if there is fertilization, that's the time that meiosis will complete. Okay, now next I would like to discuss the menstrual cycle and the hormones that are being produced during this phase. So first I'm going to describe all these graphs, and then later on I will go over the description that I've provided for you here. And of course this description you will also find in the question bank and the practice questions that I've provided for you. So the menstrual cycle is divided in a few phases. First we have the menses. So here it shows the thickness. This graph shows you the thickness of the uterine wall, right? So during the menses, the uterine wall is shedding, and that's why it causes bleeding, because it's the uterine wall that is falling apart. Then, so that's from 1 to 3 days of the menstrual cycle. Then between day 4 to 14, that's called a follicular phase. And the reason that it's called a follicular phase is that that's the time that the follicles are actually becoming mature and ready to release the egg. So during this stage, the follicular stimulating hormone acts on the Graafian follicles to secrete estrogen. So that's the time that the estrogen secretion increases a lot, right? Now, once there is an increased secretion of estrogen as well as increased secretion of luteinizing hormone, these are the signals that will initiate ovulation. So now the egg will be released. So here at this stage, the ovulation happened, and from this point on, the menstrual cycle referred to as the luteal phase. And luteal phase is basically the phase that prepares the uterine wall for potential fertilization and implantation, because you can see how the uterine wall is getting thicker and more vascularized. So it's preparing in case there is fertilization to allow the embryo to initiate implantation. So what happens once the egg is released? So the follicle that releases the egg, the remnant of that follicle is called corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum is responsible for producing progesterone. So now you can see that during the luteal phase, progesterone is being produced. And the function of progesterone is to maintain the uterine wall. If we don't have progesterone, how you can see at the end of the menstrual cycle, once progesterone drops, so does the uterine wall fall apart. So the job of the progesterone is to maintain the uterine wall. Now, if no fertilization happens, then what happens is that the corpus luteum will degenerate into corpus albicans, and so therefore now the progesterone secretion will drop, as a consequence of which now the uterine wall will fall apart and menses happens. And so this cycle will continue to happen. All right, so the hormones that are being secreted in the follicular phase, we have an estrogen surge, but then there would be a drop. Once progesterone starts to secrete during the luteal phase, estrogen surge again increases. So here you can see that the estrogen has a bimodal phase of secretion. Progesterone, however, secretes only in the luteal phase, and then luteinizing hormone and FSH are being secreted during the ovulation. Okay? Now, the scenario that we described here was if fertilization doesn't happen, then corpus luteum will degenerate, progesterone will drop, and then the whole thing will fall apart. The uterus will start to shed. Now, what happens if there is actually fertilization that is happening? So if fertilization happens, then the corpus luteum will be maintained, and it will continue to secrete progesterone until embryo actually develop its own placenta. And once placenta is made, after 10 weeks following fertilization, placenta will continue to produce its own progesterone. All right, so now with all that being said, let's go over the mechanisms that we just described here for you. So first we have the follicular, the other name for which is the proliferative phase. So initially we have low estrogen and progesterone, as a consequence of which, since there is low level of these hormones, therefore there would be a lessened negative feedback effect. So GnRH secretion will now increase, as a consequence of which hypothalamus secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone that acts on the follicular stimulating hormone, right? And follicular stimulating hormone will now recruit new ovarian follicles to increase estrogen production. So let's go back here. So because we are having low estrogen and progesterone here, there is less negative feedback on the pituitary gland, as a consequence of which there would be increased secretion of gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which also increases FSH secretion. FSH acts on the Graafian follicle to increase estrogen production. Okay? And so consequently, estrogen induces thickening of the uterine endometrium. So you can see how here the endometrium is thickening. That's from the estrogen surge. Now, increased estrogen production above a certain threshold switches negative feedback control of luteinizing hormone into a positive feedback. So once estrogen goes to a very high level, instead of providing a negative feedback, it actually stimulates luteinizing hormone secretion. And so therefore, when we have too much estrogen and too much luteinizing hormone, that's the time that ovulation happens. So these two hormones, these two changes, it's what causes ovulation. Versus menstruation is when we are having too little estrogen or too little progesterone. So let's go back right here. So now we are having a luteinizing surge and termination of the follicular phase. So by a luteinizing hormone surge, there would be ovulation. So following ovulation, it would be the initiation of luteal or secretory phase. And in this phase, LH induces ovulation, we just discussed. There would be progesterone secretion from the corpus luteum in order to help maintain the endometrium, increase body temperature, and reduce luteinizing hormone. So the corpus luteum, which was the remnant of the follicle that has released the egg, will produce progesterone in order to continue maintaining the endometrial wall, increase body temperature, and also to decrease secretion of luteinizing hormone. And so consequently, reduced LH secretion results in a gradual fall in progesterone and estrogen production with subsequent loss of endometrial supply that will lead to menses. So here, as luteinizing hormone dropped, there would be also a drop in progesterone and estrogen secretion, and we just discussed if estrogen and progesterone secretion drops, therefore there would be menstruation, which means shedding of the uterine wall. Okay? So now that was regarding the mechanism of releasing the egg. Now what happens when the egg is released? So egg is conveyed to the uterus via the fallopian tubes. So the ovary releases the egg, which via the fallopian tube, it reaches the uterus. Now what is the uterus? So uterus is actually a muscular organ that receives and protects the embryo. And there are 3 layers to the uterus, and these layers include endometrium. And as we were just discussing, all the menstrual cycle that was going on, it was to prepare the endometrial wall for potential implantation. Okay, so the first layer, or the innermost layer, is called an endometrium. And then we have the myometrium, which is basically a bundle of smooth muscles. And then finally, uterus is made of a perimetrium, which is the outside covering or the visceral covering of it, right? Then we have the inferior portion of the uterus, which will narrow into cervix. And cervix extend downwards into the vagina. All right, so that's the order: ovary, fallopian tube, uterus, and then at the bottom we have cervix and the vagina. Now other external genitalia that we have with females include, so let me erase all this. So now let's review the external genitalia of females. So external genitalia includes labia majora, which are external folds of skin. Then we have labia minora, which are actually longitudinal folds that are in between labia majora. So these are also folds of skin that are in between labia majora. Then we have the clitoris, which is an excitatory organ. And can you tell me what was the male's counterpart of clitoris? The glands of the penis. So clitoris is an excitatory organ that resembles the male glands of the penis. And this clitoris contains 2 columns of erectile tissue that's similar to the penis. It will engorge with blood during the sexual stimulation. And then finally we have the vestibules, which is the space between labia minora that contains the vestibular glands. And these glands are essential for secretion of the lubricant mucus. Alright, so these were the external genitalia in females and the function of every one of them. Alright, now that we are done with the discussion of the menstrual cycle and the external genitalia, let's talk about what happens during pregnancy, parturition, and lactation. Okay, so production of progesterone is necessary for maintenance of pregnancy, and that's the reason that sometimes progesterone is referred to as pregnancy hormone. And so now let's discuss what changes are induced by progesterone. So progesterone secretion, as we just discussed, is initially mediated by corpus luteum. So corpus luteum will initially produce progesterone, but then later on, once placenta is formed, after 10 weeks following fertilization, placenta will take over. So progesterone is first being secreted by corpus luteum, and then after 10 weeks, placenta will take over and start to produce progesterone. Now, what are the functions of progesterone? Progesterone, so that was 1 and 2 was for placenta. Now, the functions of progesterone are, it will prevent reinitiation of menstrual cycle, so it prevents restart of the menstrual cycle. It prepares the uterus for implantation. So you know how it helped engorge the uterine wall with blood and helped thickening it. It's actually preparing the uterus for implantation. It prevents myometrial contractions in order to prevent embryo to fall from the uterine wall. So prevention or decreased myometrial contractions. And then finally, it will induce hypertrophy of the breast tissues in preparation for the lactation that is coming up. Alright, I'm going to erase all this in order to discuss parturition next. So if you need to pause the video, by all means, you can go ahead and do that. Otherwise, let's go over the next stage, which is parturition. So parturition, which is basically referred to the process of giving birth. Alright, and during this time, what happens is that there will be myometrial contractions to help with the movement of the fetus downward along the uterus, and there will be also be cervical softening to help with the delivery of the baby. Now what happens here is that prostaglandins release calcium from intracellular binding site, while oxytocin also increases rate of the calcium influx, and consequently there would be increased myometrial contractions. So you know how we need the calcium for contraction of the muscles, so that's the mechanism how it works. And so consequently it can lead to initiation of labor, and then there would be cervical softening due to the loss of the collagen, and so therefore there would be dilation of the cervix in order to allow for the delivery of the baby. All right, now next let's talk about lactation. So there are mammary glands or breast, which consist of lobules that has clusters of alveoli or acini. And these acini will open into milk collecting ducts that will unite to form a lactiferous duct. And then the lactiferous ducts will join together to form areola. And from here on, there will be opening to the nipples. And so these alveoli or acini, they contain a single layer of epithelial cell, the job of which is to produce milk. And so therefore, milk will go through this path via the milk collecting ducts and lactiferous ducts until they reach the nipple and they could be fed to the baby. And then these structures also have myoepithelial cells that would help with the contraction in order to help with the flow of the milk. All right. Now the question is, how does milk production increases during pregnancy? So under the influence of estrogen, what happens is that there is increased number of alveoli that starts to happen during puberty. During the menstrual cycle, on the other hand, there would be increased estrogen as well as progesterone secretion that would now induce further growth of the alveoli or acini. As a consequence of which, that's why there would be further increased growth in the breast size. So there would be increased breast size during puberty, and then later on during the menstrual cycle, from increased secretion of estrogen or progesterone, there could be further increase in the breast size. And then during early pregnancy, there would be still continuation of estrogen and progesterone secretion, as a consequence of which, again, there would be further hypertrophy of the breast. So there would be increased hypertrophy of the breast tissues in mid-pregnancy, and so consequently towards the end of the pregnancy, the breast gain a considerable secretory ability. So it's now ready for milking the newborn. Now the question that you may have here is that the breast size keeps on increasing, and in fact by the time the mother reaches the 4th month of pregnancy, the breasts have reached enough size in order to produce milk. But now the question that you may have is that how come there won't be any milk production until after the birth? And the answer for that is that elevated estrogen and progesterone, they are acting negatively on the prolactin hormone. So let's put it again. Let me write it down. Since we are having high estrogen and high progesterone during pregnancy, prolactin hormone cannot act on the breast. So prolactin is kind of inactive during the pregnancy. But then after parturition and once birth is given, the level of estrogen and progesterone drops, as a consequence of which now prolactin can act on the breast and induce secretion of milk. Then one other mechanism that can induce secretion of prolactin is nipple stimulation. So if there is nipple stimulation, there would be increased secretion of prolactin from the anterior pituitary gland, as a consequence of which there would be further milk production. So that's one other mechanism, that as the newborn keeps on suckling on the nipple, there would be further increased production of prolactin in order to increase milk production. So now there will be increased milk production by prolactin, and then at the same time there would be secretion of oxytocin via the nipple stimulation. that will stimulate contraction of the myoepithelial cells that I just discussed with you to enhance secretion of milk. All right, so there are two different hormones that I'd like you to know here. One is prolactin, that is being secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. So this is being secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and its function is to increase milk production. And then we also have oxytocin that is being secreted by the posterior pituitary gland, and its function is to induce contraction of myoepithelial cells in order to help with the flow of the milk that is produced, and so it will lead to the secretion of milk. All right, the final topic that we are discussing here is integration of the hormones with the nervous system. So basically, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland are involved in the regulation of sex hormones. We just discussed how hypothalamus induces secretion of GnRH, and then later on pituitary gland will induce secretion of FSH and LH. And so therefore, the hypothalamus, pituitary, and gonad axis will help with the regulation of sex hormones, but they are actually being regulated by a negative feedback. So as we just discussed, products of the gonads can negatively influence secretion from the pituitary or hypothalamus. So if there is too much estrogen or progesterone secretion, they would act on hypothalamus and pituitary gland to decrease secretion of GnRH, FSH, and LH, as a consequence of which secretion of estrogen and progesterone will drop. Likewise, in males, if there is too much secretion of testosterone or inhibin, again there would be decreased secretion of GnRH, LH, and FSH. So these are all being regulated by a negative feedback loop. And so here we've discussed how the nervous system is controlling secretion of the sex hormones, but then it could also be the other way around. In fact, during the prenatal life, once the estrogen and testosterone are getting exposed to our nervous tissues, that's when our nervous tissues will start to develop receptors. And so that's why that females, since during the prenatal life they've been exposed to the blood estrogen, they have more estrogen receptor, and so they are more sensitive to the effects of estrogen. Versus males, they have more testosterone receptors, and so their hypothalamic cells will be specialized in responding to testosterone in males. And they would, since they are not really having estrogen receptors, they would be insensitive to estrogen. So therefore, early exposure to these sex hormones will help with the development of the hypothalamus pituitary gonad axis that we just discussed here with you. Alright, now we are done with the discussion of this video. There are still some questions that I would like to review before we move on with our practice questions. The first question is, what is capacitation? So I'm giving you a clue. I'm talking about the sperm production. What's the definition of capacitation refers to? So basically, the spermatozoa that leaves the epididymis, it's immobile and cannot fertilize egg. We just discussed how when the seminal vesicles secrete fluids that combines with the sperm, that's when the sperm becomes mobile. Okay, and that refers to the process of capacitation. So once the sperm becomes mobile by combining with the secretions of seminal vesicles, that's the definition we refer to, capacitation, meaning that the sperm is now mature and able to move and reach the egg. The next question is, describe the menstrual, proliferation, and secretory phases of the cell cycle. Well, in the drawing that we had, I just showed it to you, that menstrual cycle is about day 1 to 3, it could be up to day 5 of the menstrual cycle, and during this time the endometrium sheds from the uterus, and that's why there is bleeding. Then we have proliferation, or the follicular phase, and during this time the follicles will start to grow, so this is about 6 to 14 days. And then finally we have the secretory or luteal phase, during which time the endometrium becomes vascularized in preparation for potential implantation, and this is about day 15 to 28. Now I'd like to mention that secretory phase in all females is always 14 days. Now the length of the menstrual and proliferation phase can vary from, like, for instance, 7 days to 21 days. That's why when we are talking about the duration of menstrual cycles, some females can have as short as, if you add 7 with 14, as short as 21 days, while some females can have as long as, if you add 21 plus 14, of 35 days cycles. But generally, usually it's 14 plus 14 is about 28 days. The next question is describe menopause. So basically, when the ovaries stop responding to FSH, there would be a cessation of the menstrual cycle. So there would be menstrual cycle will cease, and that would be the definition of menopause. The next question is, what is the function of inhibin? Well, we just showed it right here. Inhibin acts on the anterior pituitary gland and on the hypothalamus to decrease secretion of GnRH and LH and FSH. And then the next question is, what is the function of relaxing hormone? So basically, this hormone is being secreted by corpus luteum, and its function is to facilitate the cervical softening, and that is in anticipation of parturition. All right, so relaxing hormone will cause cervical softening, basically relaxation of the cervix, and that is being done in anticipation of parturition. All right, now let's move on with some practice question. I'm going to read these questions for you. If you need more time to answer the questions, then you can pause the video. So which of the following hormones is most crucial for maintenance of pregnancy? I'm just giving you a clue. Which hormone was called the pregnancy hormone? And that gives you the answer right there. The next one is, which of the following hormone induces milk secretion upon stimulation of nipple? Remember, we are talking about secretion, not production. Okay? Then the next question is, administration of estrogen or progesterone in post-menstrual females causes, which of the following changes will likely happen? Okay? And then the next question is, which of the following best describes the negative feedback loop in the posterior pituitary gland? So if you need more time, you can pause the video, but let's move on here. So we just discussed progesterone was the hormone that was doing everything during the pregnancy. So the answer is progesterone, or the pregnancy hormone, is the most crucial for maintenance of pregnancy. The next question is, which of the following hormone will induce milk secretion? So we just discussed we have two important hormones. One is prolactin, that is being secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and its function was production of milk. While we have oxytocin, which is being secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. And of course, we do have an endocrinology lecture that we've discussed all the hormones that are being secreted by the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. But in any case, oxytocin is being secreted by the posterior pituitary gland in order to induce secretion of milk. So now it should be easy to answer this question. Which of the following hormones induces milk secretion upon stimulation of the nipple? The answer is oxytocin, which is being secreted from the posterior pituitary gland. So choice B would be the correct answer. All right, the next question that we are having here is that administration of estrogen and progesterone in postmenopausal females, what can we expect from that? So first, let me answer what happens in postmenopausal females. Since there is a decrease in estrogen production, therefore these patients can present with hot flashes, vaginal dryness, as well as risk of osteoporosis due to decreased estrogen production. And this osteoporosis is making their bones more fragile. Now, what happens if we give them estrogen or progesterone, if we supplement them during postmenopausal females? Well, what estrogen does is that it can again make the lining of the uterus to grow, and so consequently there could be some vaginal spotting that happens. Okay, so that would be one of the side effects of estrogen and progesterone supplementation in postmenopausal female. Also know that now, because we are inducing the uterine wall to grow again, there is also increased risk of endometrial cancer. So one more time, let's review all that. The symptoms that you see in postmenopausal females include vaginal dryness, hot flashes, and osteoporosis. Okay, and these are some of the important symptoms that you should know for your MCAT exam. Next, which of the following best describes the negative feedback loop in the posterior pituitary gland? Okay, so testosterone mediates secretion of GnRH? No. Testosterone inhibits secretion of GnRH. So here, let me show you quickly this feedback loop. So here you can see that testosterone inhibited the pituitary gland and hypothalamus. So LH, FSH, and GnRH secretion will be decreased. So choice A was incorrect. Production so it will induce production of testosterone by Sertoli cell. Again, no. Sertoli cells are not responsible for production of testosterone. It's Leydig cells that produce testosterone. FSH mediated secretion of inhibin. That's correct. Once we have FSH secretion, it would induce secretion of inhibin by the Sertoli cells. So here you can see that in this negative feedback loop, FSH induces Sertoli cell to produce inhibin, which now will decrease production of hormones by hypothalamus and pituitary gland. So choice C is the correct answer. And then finally, it says secretion of inhibin by Leydig cells. No, we just discussed that inhibin is being secreted by Sertoli cells. So FSH acts on Sertoli cells to secrete inhibin. All right, now let's move on to the last set of questions. Which of the following cells is analogous to a mature ovum? All right, next question. Which of the following is the primary source of progesterone production during the later stages of pregnancy? So here we are talking after 10 weeks. Then the next question is, which of the following hormones has the highest increase in production rate at point B compared to point A? Okay, so you should recall the hormone secretion, and that's actually a high yield topic. MCAT loves to ask you about hormonal fluctuations during the menstrual cycle. So which hormone has higher secretion at point B compared to point A? And then the final question is, at which stage of menstrual cycle is a female most fertile? Okay. All right. Let's go back here. If you need to pause the video to review the questions in a little more detail, by all means. Otherwise, let's move on. So which of the following cells is analogous to a mature ovum? Okay. So let me show you right here. That was the summary that I've shown you of what had happened. We had the spermatogonia stem cells forming a primary spermatocyte, secondary spermatocytes. Then we make a spermatid, which is still not mature. It has to undergo spermatogenesis in order to form spermatozoa. And then later on, spermatozoa will undergo capacitation, which makes it mobile. So there are multiple stages in order to have a mobile functional sperm. And so the answer here is spermatozoa is analogous to a mature ovum. The next question is, which of the following is the primary source of progesterone production? So we know up to 10 weeks of gestation, it's the job of corpus luteum, but following that, it's placenta that is producing the progesterone. Next question is, which of the following has the highest increase in production rate of hormone at point B compared to point A? And again, this is a high yield graph that you should memorize. Okay, so its progesterone secretion is at maximum compared at point B compared to point A. All right, so the answer for this question is at point B, we have more progesterone secretion. Versus for estrogen, there is more secretion at point A compared to point B, and that was estrogen. Okay, and then the final question is, which of the following stages of menstrual cycle is a female most fertile. At which of the following is the female most fertile? Well, the female is most fertile following ovulation. So let's see. The answer should be following ovulation. And do you recall what hormones were inducing ovulation? We just discussed elevated estrogen and elevated luteinizing hormone. So let's see if we have that here. Upon increased secretion of estrogen and luteinizing hormone, so choice B would be the correct answer. All right, now there is one last thing that I would like to discuss before I conclude this lecture, and that's a commonly asked question by our patients, which is, we had unprotected sex with our boyfriend or with our husband, what's the chance that we get pregnant? All right, and so here I'd like to review that one. Following ovulation, the egg has only a day of lifespan, so it's viable for only about 1 day. Sperm, on the other hand, can live up to 5 days in the vaginal tract, so sperm has a life of 5 days. So in order for pregnancy to happen, there should be intercourse sometime between 5 days before ovulation, at least, because if we go farther back, the sperm will be dead. So there is only a short window, like about 7 days, like about 5 to 6 days prior to ovulation and 1 to 2 days after ovulation, where the female can actually become pregnant. But if we move outside this window, then the chance of pregnancy significantly drops. I'm not going to say it's going to be 0, because there could be always surprises. Like for instance, a female that is expecting a 28-day menstrual cycle, something could go wrong, and on that cycle it could be 21 days. So therefore the ovulation cycle may move backward. And so it's possible that they get pregnant, right, when it's not expected. But overall, my point is that there is only a certain window of about 7-8 days that there is chance of pregnancy. Once we move outside that window, the chance drops almost to 0. Now, another question that they ask is that what's the function of the oral contraceptives? So basically, oral contraceptives, they contain estrogen and progesterone. So imagine that there was a sexual intercourse at this point. So now the sperm has enough time to survive and reach the egg that is being released following ovulation. So what these oral contraceptives do is that they have high concentration of estrogen and progesterone. So once taking these medications, there would be too much surge of estrogen and progesterone, which will have a negative feedback now. By a negative feedback, they would decrease secretion of FSH and they would decrease secretion of LH. So therefore, if there is decreased secretion of LH, we just discussed, one of the hormones that is required for ovulation is luteinizing hormone. So if luteinizing hormone drops, therefore there would be no ovulation. And so that's how some of these medications help with preventing ovulation. Okay, so that's about it. We are done with the second part of this video. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you for the next lecture.